Hello and welcome. Ahead of class pay gap on Sunday, we wanted to share with you some content that goes into the topic in a bit more detail. We've got an amazing panel with some amazing speakers, but before we get into it, we wanted to share with you an amazing film. It's called Stay Down. It's very thought-provoking, quite disturbing at times, but I hope it creates a reaction. So without further ado, lights, camera, action.
No, Mum. Don't work like that. Yeah, we'll come home soon.
So, do you work here?
Yeah,
Oh, me too.
if all goes to plan. It's just the interview later on today.
I'm sure we've got all the information we need.
Sometimes. Always. Never the bottom.
I didn't peg you as a fan.
Ignore it. It's just the way it is.
Good morning, Mr. Jones. How are you doing?
No. But this time a little less, you know. These people are different from whoever you have experience with. You're just not right for the role.
I got the job.
Wow. So I think we've all seen that film a number of times now. But before we get into it, I'd just like to do some introductions and then we can kind of get into reflections on it. So I'm James Whiteman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Social Mobility workstream at the Diversity Project. Sarah.
I'm Sarah Atkinson. I'm Chief Exec of the Social Mobility Foundation, a charity working on social mobility, and we made the film.
Hi there, Sophie Hulm, CEO of Progress Together. We're a membership organisation supporting financial services firms across the UK with senior level socioeconomic diversity.
I'm Helena Morrissey. I chair the Diversity Project. We have 3 key objectives, which are around social mobility, ethnicity and gender diversity, and improving that across the investment industry.
Well, thank you, all 3 of you, for being here today and discussing this. I've watched that film 2 or 3 times now, and every time it leaves me with feeling slightly unsettled. It's a really powerful film. There's a kind of dark, sinister feel to it, and the message really comes across. I wonder, just sort of, Sarah, if you could explain, you were a key part of how that film came about. If you could explain the kind of process in which you went around creating it, and then some of the reflections on how you wanted people to kind of feel and what impact you wanted it to have.
Yeah, so we're at Social Mobility Foundation. Our whole mission is about socioeconomic diversity, why it matters to people, why we want to see change. And we were finding that often the conversations about social mobility can be a bit dry. We talk about the statistics, the extent to which the attainment gap affects children and young people, or the class pay gap, as we'll talk about today. But the humanity and the human impact of it never seem to come through in those questions. You'd share the graph and people would say, oh yeah, no, that is terrible, yeah. But they didn't feel the kind of urgency that we feel. And we have these brilliant creative partners who work with us. We were talking about different ways that we could kind of bring it to life. And the idea came about, first the plan was to make a trailer that we'd share on social media as though they were a horror film, and say, actually, this isn't horror, this is reality. And our wonderful partners, the director, the actors who all got involved, got so excited and themselves quite motivated by the issues we were talking about that we actually ended up making the whole film, which you've seen. And it was really about that. It was about bringing to life the impact, the human impact, telling the powerful story. Yeah, we did want to unsettle people. We know that powerful conversations are often slightly uncomfortable conversations. They have to be. So we wanted to kind of provoke an uncomfortable feeling. We also hoped what has happened would happen, which is that people from working class backgrounds would feel seen, would recognise the film reflected their experiences, would feel brave to say, that isn't just fiction, that's happened to me. I've been that person. And that has been very powerful. What we hadn't necessarily expected, but we have experienced, is that also we'd get very brave people, sometimes in senior positions, who would say, I think I might have been the bad guy. I think I might have done that. And that's been powerful too. So it's opened up a powerful, a brave, a human set of conversations about what we think is a really important issue.
Thank you, Sarah. And Sophie, have you got any specific reflections or anecdotes that it kind of brings to mind?
Yeah, it's interesting because our membership, we have over 50 members or so, representing a third of the financial services workforce. And we hear these stories time and time again. This is not a one-off. This is not a campaign story. This is happening every day in every single organisation. And so many of our members now are really taking active steps to try and do something about it, but it is kind of commonplace. And I remember when I was at an interview myself, and the interviewer noticed that I'd gone to university in Bristol and said, I've been to the University of Bristol too. And I hadn't been to the University of Bristol. I'd been to the University of West of England, an ex-poly. And immediately I thought, I'm not going to get that job. I haven't been to the right university. And I didn't say anything. I didn't lie. It was true on my CV, but I just kind of said, and moved on. I got the job, and 2 years later at that organisation, I had a conversation with the chair of that organisation. Turned out that he had gone to an ex-poly as well. And that was my light bulb moment. I'd seen someone that was senior, that had the same educational background as I had, and that had got there. But if I hadn't have had that chance encounter when I was relatively young in my career, I would have thought I'm scuppered for life.
And Helena, do you have any...
Yeah,
stories?
well, first of all, just on the reactions to the film, I mean, the bit that really sort of struck me, you just feel his frustrations and the fact that he doesn't seem to be able to, he can't do anything about the situation, you know, and that's the bit that really resonates with me. Now I think people think it's unusual to be a woman in the city, but when I joined, it was very unusual to be from state school as I am. And I felt more out of the loop and fish out of order because of that, really, than being a woman. And even really recently, and I'm not going to divulge the role because it was a very, very senior role, so it would be a rather incendiary story, but I was being interviewed for a very significant job, and the interviewers had gone to the great trouble to keep it all very discreet of papering up the glass at the top and the bottom of the door to keep it like confidential so no one could see the candidates. And I was in a holding room. They literally called it kind of like the holding pen, you know, the holding room. But while I was there, waiting, and obviously the previous candidate was going for his interview, as I could tell it was a man, big booming voice coming through, and they were guffawing with laughter. And there's a scene in the film where the guy who's from the lower socioeconomic background is watching the guy who gets the job share a joke with the snooty boss, you know, who'd obviously been very unkind to him earlier in the day. And it so resonated with me. I brought back that feeling as I sat there, nervous, as you always are before a job interview, and just feeling completely out of it, an outsider. You know, there was this sort of camaraderie going on next door that was very masculine, but also was very much a sort of, you know, an in crowd of people that I was an outsider of. And yeah, I'm afraid that the film brought that all back, and I just thought, again, that frustration, there was nothing I could do. I knew I could never be that person who was the accepted person, whatever I did, whatever I said in the interview. And that was, yeah, a bit of a demoralising moment. But.
And I guess it feeds into imposter syndrome and many elements of that, which we talk about in diversity, equity and inclusion a lot.
Exactly. It's hardly a surprise, is it? It's not really a syndrome. It is being an imposter. You know, I've said before, I felt like an imposter. I wasn't just feeling like an imposter. I was an imposter. I was outside the loop. And just not being part of the in crowd is, I think, a particular problem for the financial services sector, because we've been very slow to change on a whole host of dimensions of diversity. And obviously one of the big ones is socioeconomic diversity, social mobility. And clearly that's a very big problem for our industry if we're not going to reflect society and if we're not going to give opportunity to people who've got so much to give and such great potential.
Yeah. And a big part of today and why we've timed this session around, and we're going to release it around the Class Pay Gap Day, we want to talk about class pay gap. I think not that many people will necessarily be aware of it or be aware of how much of an issue it is. So, Sarah, I just wonder if you could explain to everyone exactly what it is and why it's so important.
Yeah. So each year, with the assistance of very skilled technical researchers, we look at the data. We look at a huge swathe of data across the economy on salary levels of different jobs, of people from different backgrounds in those jobs, and we're able to crunch out the numbers that show you people from professional backgrounds and people from working class backgrounds and their typical earnings levels at different jobs. And what that data shows each year is that there is a pay gap for people doing very similar jobs, with very similar qualifications, requirements, the class background means there's a significant difference in that earning. Across jobs, it's nearly £7,000. It's bigger if you look only at the private sector. I'm afraid it's much bigger still if you look at financial services. So it's nearly £7,000 across the whole economy. In financial services, it's over £17,000 difference. So what that's showing is that across sectors, across groups of jobs, people are not progressing the way one would expect, not being paid the way one would expect, attributable, often very largely, to factors around class background. We're also able to support organisations. We, in partnership with Bridge Group, have put a toolkit together so that individual organisations can look at their own organisational class pay gap on a similar framework to the way that organisations will measure gender pay gap or increasingly ethnicity pay gap. So that enables an organisation to look at itself and say, what's the pay gap in our organisation by different levels for class background. Mm-hmm. And it means you can look as an organisation about whether those figures are what you would want them to be. They won't be. They won't be where you'd want them to be. You can look at your pay gap against the pay gap for your sector, for the broader economy, set benchmarks and targets. It's a really important way of understanding what's going on inside your organisation, because this isn't about who gets into your organisation. This is about who's getting on, who's progressing. People you've got in your organisation who you wanted to recruit them, you want to retain and develop them, you want them to be able to perform and achieve. And if class background is affecting that, you want to know why, because you want to know, what to do about it.
And I think there's a real business case here, because we think about broad sectors across the economy. Financial services has the highest class pay gap of all the sectors, almost 4 times higher than the tech sector. So if you think about what skills we want to bring into the financial services sector, it's absolutely the people with the tech skills. And if they're going to feel that actually they're going to feel more included and belong within another sector, they will just take their skills elsewhere.
Yeah, true.
It's rational. I mean, I'm very interested in all this because I don't think many firms are necessarily thinking about measuring their class pay gap. We've obviously seen it being the third, last bastion, as it were, of statistics that the firms even collect on people. So we do a survey each year called our Goals and Progress tool at the Diversity Project. And in the first year, in 2022, only 25% of our member firms even measure socioeconomic background or collect data on economic background. And then last year it went up to 35%, so big jump in a year. We're just about to have this year's numbers, the 24 data, come out. And I'm hopeful, because we've been explaining, actually, a lot of firms still think, well, how do you even measure it? And this idea that we always say, well, parental occupation age 14 is kind of your starting point. You might also want to ask whether they're the first to go to university, the free school meals. People are still stuck in the foothills, I think, in terms of measuring even or asking people. And there's almost, I think it's embarrassment often. I think people think it's not something that we can even ask people. But I've seen your data that suggests that when asked, over 90%, your Bridge, over 90% of people are forthcoming about their background. I'm not ashamed to have gone to state school, or not have a well-off particularly background. That's just part of who I am. It's not most people, I think, it's something they're happy to disclose.
Yeah, I think organisations can be nervous about the practicalities, as you say. What are the right questions to ask? How do we benchmark the data? There is lots of good toolkits and assistance and support available to be able to do that. The Social Mobility Commission publishes, very kind of straightforward kits to follow. I think you're right, Helena. There's also a nervousness that it is an awkward conversation. Is it okay to have this conversation? Senior people from all backgrounds actually can be quite nervous about this conversation. If you come from a very privileged background, it can feel awkward. You can feel a fish out of water. But also we know very senior people from working class backgrounds who don't feel fully comfortable. If you've come from a working class background and you're now in a very senior role in financial services, your current socioeconomic status clearly is professional. It can feel awkward. So there's definitely, as well as the practicalities, there's a nervousness about the legitimacy. And I think some of that also relates. And so if you probably want to come in here to things like, can we get an HR system? Will our recruitment agencies be able to cope with this? Is it how do we make it as simple as possible to get it all right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been working with Workday, and there are other HR platforms out there, but in terms of integrating open fields, so it's easier for their clients to be able to track socioeconomic backgrounds. That's been a game changer overnight in terms of members that are getting attaching the socioeconomic backgrounds with particular personnel records. And previously you'd see surveys being carried out, anonymous surveys to their staff. Once you can attach it to HR platforms, then you can actually track the progression, you can track the pay, you can get the class pay gap. It opens up the possibilities. But we've been really positive. Actually, we've seen that there's been an increase in employees within our member firms submitting their data. So last year, I believe it was 49% of employees across our member firms were sharing data. This year it's 58% in terms of that response rate. So that psychological safety, that element of trust is really increasing year on year, which is positive to see. And I think it's a matter of time. The more firms that talk about this, the more we as individuals. Exactly.
Yeah. And we've seen that with obviously the gender pay gap, that I think initially people were quite, what's it going to pretend? What's the implications of this? I would like to cite the fact that, this whole, it's a bit of a cliche, what gets measured gets managed. But the reality is that gender pay gap, even in financial services, so I do this rather depressing task every year where I sit down with a spreadsheet and I've got all the firms that have disclosed their gender pay gaps right back to 2017 when it first became mandatory for larger firms. And the gaps are still huge in investment services firms, but they've gone down by a quarter, 25% in both the salary gap and in the bonus pay gap. So I'm really encouraged by that, because I think, again, people are now conscious of it. And I'm really believe that if people were looking at this as normal data that they would just ask for and track, you would see people actually getting the progression right, and actually thinking, well, it's not just an accident that we end up with people leaving because they don't feel included, and actually then we go backwards on our class pay gap. These things are all related. And so the measurement isn't just a kind of, bureaucratic bother. It actually helps keep us honest and helps people think actually something is going to be done, and people are going to watch out for, are we giving people an opportunity?
And I think that's why the regulators play such an important role here in terms of encouraging organisations to start collecting that data and to be reporting on it. Because like I said, our members, we now have 200,000 employees reporting their data through our membership. And that represents a third of the financial services workforce across our membership in total. But what about the other organisations? What's going to bring them to the table?
Well, do you think we need mandatory? Do you think there's a route to mandatory?
Yes, in a word, because I think otherwise we'll sit back and we'll wait. You'll have a third of the workforce of the financial services sector actively pushing forward, and they want to be at the front. But we need the rest of the sector to play ball. Otherwise, that talent just isn't going to be circling around at the top.
And I think we should draw attention to the fact that in the draft regulations that the regulators put out around diversity, equity and inclusion, and they suggested various categories, did include socioeconomic data as a category to look at, but didn't make it a mandatory suggestion in their draft regulations. And they sort of put it as, we were like, well, why would you, I don't want to say play God, but, decide. Why would you be the ones to decide, yes, ethnicity should be mandatory, no, socioeconomic data should not be mandatory? Because we've I love the idea of, just people stepping up on a voluntary basis and doing it. But after years and years and years, sometimes you have to kind of make it mandatory for something to change. And I think people have had a long time, and having it mandatory would mean that people who do think it's all too difficult or who are worried about the implications of asking people would just overcome that. And we've seen that time and again, that people just, okay, you have to do it. Oh, lo and behold, we can do it.
And the lack of data was one of the reasons for not having it mandatory, because there was a survey conducted by the regulators a couple of years ago where there weren't very many organisations collecting socioeconomic background data. We're now 2 or 3 years on, and there's huge swathes of organisations now. If they don't have that data, they're starting to build it into the HR platforms so that within a year they will have that data. Now's the time to act, I would say.
Yeah. I think organisations as well need to recognise the pressure from the workforce, particularly a young workforce. one of the most sort of searched and asked questions around all aspects of HR management is a Gen Z workforce. How do you deal with them? How do you engage them? They seem to be different. And absolutely one of the things that is strongest, not just from young people coming to the workforce from a working class background, but young people from all backgrounds want and expect the organisation they work for to lead in this space, to lead in this conversation. They absolutely recognise the kind of issues that the film shows, the kind of issues we talked about. So their question isn't, do you have a problem? Their question is, what are you doing about this problem? And if you don't have any data or any evidence of what you're doing or what efforts you're making, that's a real recruitment weakness that will be exploited.
And as Sophie said earlier, we're now competing with tech firms, for talent.
And investors are starting to ask about this as well. And they need the data. And if we don't have the data as firms, what are we going to tell them? We have time after time, our asset management members are saying they're being asked, increasingly so.
Yeah.
Can I just... I'm really intrigued, Sophie, so forgive me for asking a moderator question, really, but I'm very keen to talk about the progression part, because obviously there's the getting people in, collecting the data. Your organisation, which Diversity Project is very proud to partner with, Progress Together, is all about progression. And the film is all about, you get in the door, or you might get in the door, maybe not, but if you get in the door, then you get excluded from the opportunities for the next level. And I'm really interested in what you would suggest that firms can do to sort of sense check that scene in the movie or the film, where you can see the difficulty in people's unconscious attitudes. Perhaps maybe the snooty boss didn't really think of himself. I think he did when he said, "I'm sorry, I was a bit brusque earlier today." But how do organisations sort of create systematic change so that people are measured on their contribution, not on where they went to school or how they talk, or what was the guy saying about how would it get at work out with clients, how would that go? How could you be charm me? It's like, I don't think that the guy should learn to speak in a different accent. No. So what does a firm do to open the doors to them?
It's a really good question, because that's what our members ask us all the time. What's the practical advice? So yes, we've got it. We understand the business case. Now help us. The first part is about data. Know what your data is saying, which, as we've just been talking about, there will be different departments, different regions, different subsectors within financial services that have more or less of a challenge when it comes to the progression piece. It's really just important to understand your own data. What is your own data telling you within the organisation? And then to have accountable leadership. So leaders that will stand up in front of all their employees saying this is important, but not just once a year then forgetting about it and not doing it again, but actually asking for that data and asking for what progress has been made on a quarterly basis, reporting that progress to the board, being accountable for change. We're delighted that we've got relationships with ExCo sponsors across our member firms that are absolutely doing that. Process is not people. I often say that. Fixed process is not people. So this isn't about people having to fix themselves or to change their accent or to do something different. We did a piece of work with the Bridge Group which looked at performance and the link between socioeconomic background and performance. We know that individuals from working class backgrounds progress slower, but there is no link to job performance. Yet, what is the reason that they're not progressing as fast?
Or getting paid as much.
Or not getting paid as much. And so we need to think about the processes around that. So work allocation. Many of our members now are thinking, how do we allocate the work in a fair and transparent way? Who's getting the projects that get you noticed by the senior leaders, that get you that visibility and that kudos?
It's massive.
And often it's people that might have connections within the firm, that have already done a project with somebody else. If you're not that person, you won't necessarily get that route through. Senior sponsorship. So often mentoring is talked about, but in financial services, we know that senior sponsorship is key. So who's being talked about? Who is having your back, talking about you when behind closed doors to the right people?
In a positive way.
In a positive way, absolutely. And now often as senior leaders, we want to support people that remind us of ourselves when we were younger. That's human nature. But if everyone at the top is from a particular socioeconomic background, then of course the people that are going to be talked about also will be. So developing transparent processes around allocating those senior sponsors. So perhaps the sponsee chooses the sponsor rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And so it's really kind of lifting the roof off the bonnet, so to speak, and seeing what's going on that's relevant for your particular firm, because one size doesn't fit all, and it's not the same for every single department, occupation or subsector, as I say. Now, some of our members are now further ahead and they're setting goals and targets on this, which is great. So the likes of Schroders, Santander, I think Santander is 35% of senior leaders from a working class background. And it's only when you go public with those goals that your peers decide to follow suit. So I welcome those firms that are ahead of the curve and pushing themselves and pushing their peers to compete.
Yeah.
And Sarah, as part of your work with the Social Mobility Index, is there any other kind of practical points that you would draw out? Because there's an amazing body of work that you guys produce every year.
Yeah, well, thank you. And the Social Mobility Employer Index is there to share and spread good practice, to encourage organisations to share with us what they're doing, to share with each other, and to get feedback on, particularly on what's effective. Sophie's identified some of the things that we would absolutely point to. Sponsorship, work allocation is really important. There's some good case studies in the index that we share from other sectors. I think PwC and KPMG have both done a lot of work looking at the experiences of employees and progression, and kind of feeding that in, remembering that data doesn't always have to be a massive survey. A focus group, a structured conversation can give you really powerful data about what has stopped you from applying for partnership, for example, and other conversations to have there. What are those accelerated jobs, and how do we make it clearer that there are particular accelerated jobs or areas that can be really helpful if your ambition is to get to senior level? I think the Co-op as well has done some really interesting work examining, as a big retail group, which you would think would be excellent for social mobility, examining how people progress in their organisation, and had some really interesting conversations with their workforce about attitudes to risk, kind of willingness to make shifts and take risks in the organisation from people that, from the senior perspective, had every potential to become really senior and high-flying managers. So there's some really powerful examples in there, and I think it's also really important to join pieces up. We see in the index that employers, not just in financial services, across every sector, often put a huge amount of effort into their outreach to make sure that they're thinking about who gets in. And that is very important, very necessary. I don't want people to take away from that. But if you assume that once people have got into your organisation, you can stop thinking about socioeconomic diversity, you can stop having a conversation with them about socioeconomic diversity, and you can stop holding yourselves to account, then you will lose those people you've put so much effort into recruiting, who have the talent to go far. And we hear that in the index. There are organisations that do brilliant outreach, brilliant recruitment schemes, and then we say, what are you doing inside to make sure that people can get on and explore belonging from a socioeconomic diversity perspective? Very little. And that's a real waste of that effort, as well as undermining other diversity and inclusion efforts, because if you're having a powerful EDI conversation that doesn't have social mobility in it, you will be losing some of the momentum to power your other diversity inclusion efforts, because they are so evidently interwoven.
Yeah, and maybe just on that point, I think we've got time for one more kind of question for all of you to touch on, but intersectionality is a slightly contentious word. It's maybe not the best word, but how these factors and these characteristics intertwine, I think, is really important, how we think about them. And often in social mobility, I think it's Sam Friedman, the sociologist, who talks about actually how it's a lot easier sometimes for men to lean in to their working class backgrounds than versus females and women. So do you have any kind of reflections on how we can best think about, whether it's interrelationed with gender or ethnicity and some of the other diversity characteristics? Maybe, Helena, to you.
Well, I know one thing we all worried about is creating sort of top trumps of diversity. It's like there shouldn't be a competition between different dimensions of diversity. I mean, the diversity project is launching. It's not really sort of fully formed yet, but something we're calling Next Generation Talent Programme. And the different strands to it, and one will be around apprenticeships, which are very, I think, underutilised in our industry. And we see this just as a forerunner to what we're going to call the Future Investment Leaders Programme, which we should talk about, Sophie, and how we might collaborate on that. But all the way through, we're saying, well, let's just make sure as well that when we're looking for people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, we're also checking it's sort of roughly 50-50 male-female, that we're also checking that it's not all based in one part of the country. You know, we're getting good applications across the country, that we've obviously got a great ethnicity spread. I think you just have to keep reminding yourself that actually solving for one issue is not what we're about here. We're actually about, you know, making an opportunity for everybody. And I definitely want to emphasize this is not about excluding people who've come from a privileged background or who are white men or whatever. This is about making sure that there is an opportunity for everyone, and also to be themselves when they arrive. And we've talked a bit about that. That it's not you have to fix yourself to fit in once you get there. So I just think we have to keep reminding ourselves at every stage, and not to sort of silo these initiatives.
And if you think of almost like a Venn diagram in terms of what has impact on socioeconomic background, gender, ethnicity, whatever it might be, there's something in the middle that these are interventions that work regardless of what you're trying to tackle. You know, it's around getting the data, setting goals, knowing where your starting point is, where you want to get to, changing those processes around promotion so that it's fair regardless of where you are, what your background is. It's based on performance. And often people talk about financial services being meritocratic. Often that's just talk. And actually, once you really look at the data, there are other decisions being made. And that works whether you're trying to solve for gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and all sorts of different kind of diversity characteristics. And I think there's something that we need to do in terms of bringing the employee resource groups together as well. Because often in firms you have a network competing for budget and resources with another network, and they've all got their own kind of passion projects. And actually what they're all trying to do is very similar interventions. And I think there's a real kind of case to bring it all together.
Yeah. When I go into organisations to talk about our work and the index and the work we do, so often I hear two different but complementary things. I hear people saying, I've never really felt part of the diversity and inclusion conversation before, but I feel brought into this. This is me. I feel seen. But I also hear people saying, as a woman of colour, or as a person with neurodiversity and from a working class background, this is really the thing I want to talk about, or this feels like a really important part of the conversation to talk about. So it can both open up the diversity conversation to people who don't feel privileged but don't feel part of it. But it also can really knit together important conversations and bring out the extent to which what we're talking about is actually about people's capability, potential, giving everyone the opportunity to do what they can do best, and trying to harness all of that. And we know, Brown Jacobson, which is a law firm which has topped the index, joint top this year. One of the examples that they share is work that they did that was targeted at socioeconomic diversity in terms of changing their recruitment processes, had a more positive impact on their ethnic diversity than some of the work that they've done to target recruiting a more ethnically diverse group, because, as Sophie says, there are some interventions that are just really powerful and really exciting. And I think that's the thing I want to make sure people get from this. I know it's work, I know there's data to collect, I know it's complicated, I know teams are stretched, but this is exciting because this is solving problems that you are experiencing that you want to fix, about recruiting and retaining the best possible people to do the best possible work and make your organisation more successful. That's a problem everybody wants to solve, and we know some of the answers.
Can I just pick up on something you said as a final point? Because the chap from Brown Jacobson who had devised a new recruitment process that transformed, I think he said they were like 85th in the index, and then they were first, something like that. He came to our annual event and he spoke about it, and it was so, it's a story worth sharing because it shows the need to be imaginative sometimes, because a lot of these processes, it takes a bravery to kind of come up with something new. And he introduced he dropped the 2-1 or higher from a Russell Group university as an entry criteria for their new recruits, but he didn't tell anybody. And it was only a couple of years. He said, you know, then so one of his partners said, how is that outrageous? You know, what's happened? You never asked him. And he said, well, first of all, he had done his homework and he'd worked out that I think it was something like a quarter of the current partnership didn't have a 2-1 or higher from a Russell Group university. So he had got his back covered there. But also he said, but have you been discouraged by the level of, you know, the caliber of the recruits? And they said, no, they're better than ever. Carry on was the kind of final message. So again, I would just encourage people who think, oh, we've tried this, we've tried that. If it doesn't work, try something new, be imaginative, be bold, and ask the people who you're trying to, you know, make feel included, how are they feeling? Not just assume you know the answer.
And I think it's important for us all to take individual responsibility, even if we're not the head of diversity, equity, inclusion, or we're just an employee.
Business,
You know, what do you say in those meetings if you notice that someone isn't speaking up, but that might have, you know, very, you know, valid views? How do we bring people in to make people feel included? We developed a piece of work with LSE and HSBC, which is kind of practical guidance on what middle managers, team leaders, but also individuals can do to push this agenda forward. So you don't have to wait for your diversity, equity, inclusion teams, and some organisations don't have diversity, equity and inclusion teams if they're smaller organisations. This isn't just the job of HR, this is the job of all of us.
And as a plug, that's voice, isn't it?
Yes.
You call it voice, yeah. And look, I think we could all talk for a lot longer on this topic. It's clearly a lot of passion in the room. I just want to say thank you to Helena, Sophie and Sarah for giving your precious time up today. And I think if anyone else wants to sort of find out more, there's 3 amazing websites here. So you've got the Diversity Project, you've got Progress Together, and you've got the Social Mobility Foundation. Go onto the websites, find out more. Hopefully, wherever you are in this journey, this has been a sort of helpful step in understanding the kind of complex issues that we're trying to sort out, and that it's a really positive way forward that we've got.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.